To Beau, who will talk about cannabis legalization and social equity, opportunities, puzzles, and trade-offs. We'll follow his talk by a moderated Q&A. I know several of you have submitted questions ahead of time, and we'll try to make sure we get to all of those, as well as any questions that you may put in the chat. Let me introduce Beau. Beau is the co-director of the RAND Drug Policy Research Center, a senior policy researcher at RAND, and a professor of policy analysis at the RAND School of Public Policy. His research lies at the intersection of public health and public safety, with the focus on social equity. And he also focuses on substance use, illegal markets, crime control, and looking at the general public policy landscape. Some of his current projects include the consequences of cannabis legalization, with a special focus on social equity, 24/7 sobriety programs, illegal fentanyl markets, and the implications of legalizing psychedelics. His publications have appeared in many reputable sources, including in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences and Science. He received his his Ph.D. in public policy from Harvard University and his MPP from the University of California, Berkeley, and a BA in international relations from the Michigan State University. And with that, I will turn it over to Beau.
Good. Okay. Well, I'm really happy to be with all of you today. My plan is to present for no more than 15 minutes, and then really open it up for Q&A or any kind of reactions or comments you may have. Before I get into it, some standard disclosures. I want to make it clear I haven't taken money from the cannabis industry. My cannabis research right now is currently funded by the state of California. I've also recently had projects funded by NIDA, the European Union, state of Washington, and the Fairbanks Foundation based in Indianapolis. I was an independent advisor to the Canadian government when they were doing their 5-year review of their legalization efforts. And I was also a member of the NASEM committee, as well as a recent GAO expert panel. That's all to say the views I'm going to present here are mine. They don't reflect any funders or partners or Canada or any other organizations. But and what I'm going to discuss is based on a number of different collaborations, different books and reports, and also just a couple of weeks ago we released a few different reports, all focused on Indiana, which actually may be of interest to those of you in Illinois, considering being border states, and what happens in Illinois affects Indiana, and vice versa. You can download any of these at rand.org/cannabis or nationalacademies.org. But let's begin. I mean, this isn't news to any of you, but social equity has played a much larger role in cannabis legalization discussions. And I was around these conversations at the very beginning, and when we talked about social equity or racial equity, it was really mostly focused on arrests, like reducing arrests and reducing disparities, racial disparities in arrests. But over time, the conversations really began to evolve. You started seeing some states allowing individuals to expunge or seal, certain cannabis offenses. But early on, when states would do that, they still put the onus on the individual. So they may have to petition the court, they may have to hire a lawyer. And so there were still some barriers there. And then over time, as states started doing this, you saw an increasing number putting the onus on the state, saying the state was in charge of actually kind of sealing or expunging these records, not requiring people to petition the courts. And then obviously there's been more of a discussion about how to use cannabis taxes to address different inequities. And you're seeing a lot, and we've seen a lot in terms of increasingly focusing these conversations on promoting entrepreneurship or employment in the cannabis industry. But there are a lot of trade-offs to consider when thinking about developing these equity programs or equity efforts, especially in terms of entrepreneurship and employment. First of all, if the target population or if the area is too large, there'll be fewer benefits to distribute, and there could be a higher risk of helping those who weren't the intended recipients. Also, if the beneficiaries are defined by race or ethnicity, this could really, lead to legal challenges. And so we've seen it in most states. They don't specifically mention race or ethnicity, but they'll use different proxies because that's where a lot of the equity efforts are focused on. But those aren't the only kind of groups that we think about with respect to equity. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Other thing to think about is if you're concentrating opportunities in certain communities, and this could increase availability and use in some of those places. And I say, and most importantly, it's already hard for small businesses to compete in these markets, and I think it's going to become increasingly difficult, especially when we start thinking about prices. So the second point I want to make is that cannabis prices are declining and they're dropping quite a bit in a number of states. And this matters for a lot of different outcomes. So if you look at a lot of the topics that get discussed in legalization debates, whether it be what's going to happen to the size of the illegal market, what's going to happen to consumption, what's going to happen to tax revenues, what's going to happen to the profitability of licensed businesses, which has implications obviously for employment and also social equity, all of these are going to depend on the price. And there are a lot of reasons why we would expect legalization is going to push down those production and distribution costs. Most importantly, you're getting rid of the risk. Typically, if, back in the day when someone's purchasing cannabis, or cocaine or methamphetamine, a lot of what you're doing is compensating the drug dealers and everyone else along the supply chain for the risk of arrest and risk of incarceration. With legalization, that goes away. There's also this idea that Peter Reuter coined, the structural consequences of product illegality, which is just a fancy way of saying that when you're operating in the illegal market, there's just a lot of inefficiencies. And then once things move above board, you can take advantage of different types of technology, and things just tend to be more efficient. Also, if large organizations are allowed to produce or to sell, there could be increasing returns to scale. So for all those reasons, we would expect these production and distribution costs to go down. This doesn't mean the retail prices have to fall. There's some different things you could do, for example, implementing a minimum unit price for THC as a way to try to mitigate this decline at the retail level. But that's not how it's played out in the United States so far. So this is just looking at what's happened in Oregon since they legalized, and this is just looking at the median price per gram of flower. And you can see in late 2016 it was above $10. By middle of 2025, it was closer to $3 for a median price. And the thing to keep in mind here is this is not adjusted for potency or for the THC concentration. So we've been analyzing a lot of the data from California, and we found, and this is just looking at, since 2020, that once you account for the THC concentration in these products and you look at the price declines, we've seen that for flowers, vapes, as well as pre-roll, the infused pre-rolls, the median price per 10 milligrams of THC has pretty much dropped in half just over a 5, 6 year period. And also, you can get this stuff, at a very low price in states very close to Illinois. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we just finished doing a bunch of work for the state of, or related to the state of Indiana. So, as part of that, I was looking at what was happening not only in the markets in Indiana, but also in Michigan. And so, my parents live in northern Michigan, so after the 4th of July last year, I road trip Michigan and Indiana, stopped in every single store, and I'm heading down toward the Indiana border, and I was going to go to I was going to go to some of the towns close to South Bend, and all of a sudden I saw this billboard for a $25 ounce. I was like, wait, what? What is that? And then two exits later, I see another billboard for it, another one. And so, I wasn't planning on going to this town, but I was like, okay, I've got to pull over. And sure enough, I get to this small town, and they've got two dispensaries, one across they're across the parking lot from each other. This True Leaf is kind of more of I think a chain, where on the right you had your mom and pop shop, and both of them were selling $25 ounces. And and so I spent some time. It was near closing time, so I went to the mom and pop shop and talked to them for a while and asked them how they could sell it so cheaply. And they told me there just was a lot of people that were producing a lot nearby. And so there was kind of a glut there. But what he was saying is like there are a number of people that are coming from other states to purchase there, not just Indiana, but also Illinois. He said, yeah, it's legal in Illinois, but it's way cheaper here for people to purchase and then just kind of take it back. So the prices are declining quite a bit in a number of states. And if you think they're going down now, This is all with federal prohibition. And if there was some type of federal legalization where it was no longer illegal to move cannabis across state lines, you could imagine those prices declining even more. I mean, we've estimated that, and this was a few years ago, that you could produce all of the Delta 9 THC that's consumed in the United States on a few dozen industrial sized farms. That's it. So the industry could concentrate really quickly if there was some form of federal legalization. And so just the takeaway here is, yeah, prices are going down. They could go down even more. So the third thing the point I want to raise is, especially when you think about social equity and entrepreneurship, a number of jurisdictions or states, they'll put some of the tax revenue into entrepreneurship or employment opportunities in the cannabis industry. But actually, given what we're seeing with the price declines and the competition, one thing to think about is that it might make more sense to use some of these cannabis tax revenues to support entrepreneurship and employment in non-cannabis businesses. And so this is just something to consider as you're either setting up one of these equity programs or you're looking to make changes. Just thinking about what's going to happen with these continued price declines, because the last thing you want to do is put people in a situation where they actually could end up doing worse. And as I said, it's already harder, it's already difficult for small businesses to compete. And I think it's just going to get more difficult. So I just wanted to raise this as this is something that should at least be on the table in jurisdictions that are trying to figure out how can I use cannabis policy, to improve economic well-being in certain communities. It may make more sense to put that money into non-cannabis businesses. But whatever you end up deciding to do, I think it's really important to do the analysis beforehand. Be specific about what groups are you talking about. I mean, when we talk about social equity, oftentimes we're talking about racial equity, but also there are other places where they'll include veterans in these programs. And so you just need to be specific about what groups you're trying to help and what are the goals. And once you have that, then you can begin thinking through, okay, if this is my goal, okay, here are the different policy options I have. You can just do the standard policy analysis. And one of the things that's been kind of difficult to watch over the years is I've seen an increasing number of places adopt these programs, but they really haven't kind of thought through what could happen and what it would actually mean for the people they're intending to help. And especially thinking about this in terms of what would happen if there was a big change at the federal level. So this is really important to do, whether or not you're setting up one of these markets, or even if you've got one now, really thinking about, okay, are we allocating our resources to the programs that are going to be most likely to help these individuals in the communities that we're trying to help? And the final point I want to make is, it's really unclear how this medical rescheduling, the announcement that the deputy or the acting attorney general made, I think it was August or it was April 23rd. It's unclear about how this is going to affect small cannabis businesses, especially in the long run. Right. I mean, in terms of, there was a lot in those 33 pages, and we could talk more about the specifics, but some kind of big takeaways from this is making it clear, like, it does not federally legalize cannabis for any reason. And kind of the big thing that it does is it would reschedule cannabis products that are produced and sold in state legal medical markets. And, this could reduce the federal tax burdens for some businesses. As many of you know, there's that part of the IRS Code 280E, which essentially says that if you're trafficking in Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 substances, you can't claim kind of normal business deductions on your federal taxes. So by moving from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, you would be able to do that. So it's gonna be less of a burden for at least right now for these medical businesses. And the other thing which was really interesting about the order is there was actually a sentence in there which encouraged the Secretary of the Treasury to consider retroactively or retrospectively applying it, meaning that if they went through with that, some of these businesses could get a refund for a lot of the taxes they paid for years ago. So essentially, money going from the taxpayers to the cannabis companies. There's also the possibility that it might increase research. You can do research on Schedule 1 drugs, but there are a lot of hoops you need to jump through. There are fewer hoops if it's Schedule 3. And also the AG's rescheduling order did, specifically call out the fact that they wanted people to do more research on the products that are actually sold in stores. I mean, that's the thing. There's all this health research and everything going on. Most of it is not based on the products that people are actually purchasing. So the order actually said that for those who have a DEA license to do research, that if they were going to do research with products from these state medical markets, that they wouldn't be at risk of civil or criminal penalties. I mean, we'll see what happens with this, but the bigger question here is even if you reduce some of these barriers, who is going to pay for this research? That's going to be really important. And given the changes happening with the National Institutes of Health, which tends to fund a lot of this work, it's unclear how that's going to play out. The other thing, especially for small businesses, is think about advertising. So with a move from one to three, that's going to be more money available for businesses that they could put into advertising, but also they're now going to be able to deduct those advertising costs. So, while the reduction in the tax burden could help some of your small businesses, if the bigger companies start putting a lot more money into advertising and branding, it's unclear about how what that's going to mean in terms of your smaller businesses that wouldn't be able to advertise as much. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. We're still waiting on some details, especially with respect to what this means for dual licensees, and that is those that are selling medical and non-medical products. And there could be some bigger changes down the road. And so another part of this rescheduling order, not only did it reschedule it for medical, it said that it would, beginning at the end of June, they were going to start the hearings or start the process up for potentially rescheduling all cannabis products, not just medical, from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. And it kind of had an aggressive timeline in terms of trying to have a lot of that resolved by the middle of July. I don't know how that's going to play out, but especially if this goes beyond medical, that could lead to some bigger changes. And but who knows if it's actually going to all happen? I mean, anti-legalization folks have already filed lawsuits saying what the Attorney General did was in violation of federal law. They're also one of the subcommittees at the federal level passed a budget rider, essentially not allowing any funding to be used to implement rescheduling. I mean, this committee has passed something like this before, but it never went into law. But that's the thing to kind of keep in mind. There's still a fair amount of uncertainty here about how this is all going to play out. So my final slide is like, obviously, I think social equity should be part of these legalization discussions. But I do think it's going to be important to be specific about the definitions, what groups you're really trying to help, via cannabis policy, and also what are the specific goals that you're trying to accomplish. And once you have the groups defined and the goals, then really begin to do the analyses to make sure that you're actually allocating resources into equity programs that are going to actually help these individuals and not potentially put them at risk of being harmed. Um, Also, when you're kind of doing these analyses, you have to think about, what could happen at the federal level, especially with respect to price. And I just want to say it again. I mean, there are options, even when those production and distribution costs go down quite a bit. There are options you have to potentially prevent the retail market from bottoming out. For example, a minimum unit price in terms of, minimum unit price per unit of Delta 9 THC. I'm not aware of any place that's implemented that yet, but especially outside of the United States, you see more places looking into or implementing minimum unit pricing for alcohol. And the emerging research on that suggests that it does seem to help kind of from a public health perspective. And the final point I want to make, whether or not you're setting up some of these programs or you're looking to amend them, is really thinking outside the box. And that is not necessarily thinking, okay, this is because we're using cannabis tax revenues, we have to focus on entrepreneurship and employment in the cannabis industry. And I encourage you to kind of think broader about this. Because as I said, with these price drops, it's just going to make it harder for some of these businesses to compete. So with that, I will close. I look forward to any questions or comments you have. I know we have just a limited amount of time here, but feel free to reach out. My email is at kilmer@rand.org, and I'd be happy to try to help answer any questions you have. And if I can't answer them, I'll try to point you in the directions of the people who can. So thank you very much, and yeah, let's open it up.
Great. Thank you so much, Beau. So there's been a number of questions that have come in through the chat, so I'll get through those. And then I know that there's a number of questions that were submitted ahead of time, so I'll circle back to that afterwards.
Okay.
I encourage you to put your questions in the chat. I know some folks are having trouble with the Q&A feature. And I also invite you to go ahead and take yourself off mute and on video, and feel free to jump in and ask your question if you'd like prefer to do it that way. Following the Q&A, there will be a short survey that I forgot to mention earlier, that I'll give you all the link for after we wrap up the Q&A. So there were a number of questions that came in about your field work in Michigan. There was some excitement around that. One is great field work photos. Um, but two, uh, uh, you know, how is there any more explanation of how they got to the $25 ounces? Are they doing testing with that? Are there COAs? How are they ensuring that the cannabis is safe for the public?
Yeah, so I asked about that because like, how are you getting this down to $25 an ounce? And and I think the THC level, I mean, this reported THC levels were between 20 to 25%. So I mean, this wasn't ditchweed. Um, but as I said, this was a small town. It was called Lawrence, Michigan, about 45 minutes from the Indiana border. And they said that there just were a number of producers in the area, and they were producing a lot. And so you kind of had this glut. And so he was saying that at the wholesale level, the retailer could get a pound for about $250. So obviously, so there's, so you're still making money, from the $25 ounces, but just like any other business, they're also going to try to upsell you on the vape pens and things where there's a higher margin. I do want to say that these were kind of the extreme. Well, they weren't necessarily, I mean, these were low. I mean, I think right now the average price, the last time I checked, the average price for an ounce in Michigan was closer to $60. I mean, that's a big deal. I mean, I think in 2021, it was about $250. Then a year later, it was $150. So it's continued to decline. I have heard of ounces going for less than $25 in Michigan. I'm not sure about kind of the quality or the potency there. But yeah, I mean, this is going through the testing process. But they just Michigan, they just gave out a lot of licenses. And so I think right now they have, I mean, I'm not sure about in terms of the total number of production licenses, but I know that in terms of retailers, I think they have something along the lines of 900 retail shops. And if you look at, for example, in Ohio, they just, with the passage of SB 56 at the end of 2025, they just capped retail stores at 400. And so these are choices, right? You could be more restrictive in terms of the number of retail licenses or with production, and obviously that could uh, um, kind of mitigate some of these price drops. But Michigan, kind of similar to Oregon, they really have just kind of given out a lot of licenses, and and that not only has implications for Michigan, but also for bordering states.
Great. Thanks, Beau. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Maureen asked about retro taxes. So consider a retro tax back to the 2018 due to the inequities of the Farm Bill between adult, medical, and hemp. All the various sectors. What do you think about that, Beau?
Well, I think so. So, what the Attorney General's order said that encouraged the Secretary of Treasury to look into providing kind of retroactive or retrospective tax relief. I think right now just for those medical businesses. I don't know if I don't know if that's actually going to happen. That wouldn't necessarily apply to hemp because hemp isn't Schedule One, so those businesses aren't as subject to this as when we think about kind of the businesses that are uh, you know producing or selling what's defined under federal law as marijuana, which we typically refer to as cannabis. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it'll be if the Secretary of Treasury does do that, one could imagine a scenario where if down the line you see all cannabis products move to Schedule 3, not just those that are in the state medical or state legal medical markets. You can imagine those businesses try to push for something like this as well. And that would be even a bigger transfer from the taxpayers to the cannabis businesses. So I don't know if that would end up, how much of a backlash that would end up creating. But yeah, it'll be really interesting. I mean, they're still ironing out the details here, and as I said, they're just still trying to figure out a lot with respect to dual use. I haven't seen anything definitive on that yet, but I think once they kind of figure that out, then we'll see whether or not Treasury looks into providing some type of kind of retroactive relief for these companies.
Thanks. So you talked about the DOJ order and the hearing to consider the broader cannabis rescheduling effort. So right now, the DOJ order essentially has moved only certain products to a Schedule 3 category. So those that are state medical products as well as FDA approved
Yep.
products.
Mhm.
If the federal government does decide to reschedule all of cannabis to Schedule 3, how would that affect adult use markets?
I think you'd see a lot more advertising, right? Same reason. So you move it from one to three, that means those businesses not only have more money available to advertise, they can then write it off. And then also within the Controlled Substances Act, I think the Congressional Research Service had a little bit about this. There are certain restrictions related to advertising Schedule 1 that doesn't apply to Schedule 3. So I think you would end up seeing just a lot more advertising. Um, and whether or not that leads to more concentration in the market, I don't know.
Another question similar to this that was pre-submitted was how does rescheduling affect dual license holders, so adult use and medical license holders?
Yeah, I don't, I don't know at this point. I do know that, yeah, so we're still waiting to hear from the FDA and a lot of other federal agencies about some of the specifics here. Um, I do know that, so right now, if you are a state licensed medical business, in order to be able to kind of get that tax relief for it to go, when it goes from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, you actually have to register with the DEA. So I believe that portal is open right now. And one of the questions they actually ask in that portal is whether or not you're also selling non-medical, I don't, maybe they call it recreational, but essentially, are you also selling non-medical product? And so it's unclear to me, well, if you say yes, does that mean that they may just reject your application? Or are they going to issue guidance so that way the dual use licensees will have to, kind of have separate accounting on the medical side as well as on the non-medical side. So I don't actually know how that's going to play out. Um, and so I think hopefully over the next few months or a few weeks, we'll have more guidance, from the various kind of federal actors about what they think is going to be appropriate for the dual use. So I think it remains to be seen.
Great. And there's been some questions about, it's unfortunate that advertising seems to be, something that might be encouraged with this action. But what about education? I think it would be great to see a lot more education for uh, physicians, clinicians, medical staff, as well as others who might need to be aware of how to advise others on the use of cannabis. So when will cannabis education become mandatory, do you think? Or when do you think that that will play a bigger role in this transition that we're undergoing?
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And obviously, states have different programs, but I mentioned I was part of this National Academies panel where we were kind of looking at, hey, it's been 10 years of legalization in the U.S. What have we learned? And I got to tell you, one of the big takeaways from that report, which is free to download, is that look, even if the federal government's going to keep cannabis prohibited, or even if they keep it Schedule 1, there's a lot that the federal government could be doing to help states, whether it be provide, advice or having consistent testing standards, but also there's a lot it could be doing in terms of education and prevention. Like that can be happening right now, regardless of this whole rescheduling conversation. But it raises the question, will, with, if it does get rescheduled, will the federal government put more funds into this? And, especially will the FDA, what will they do? I don't know. And I mean, it's the same when we talk about research. So yes, it could reduce some of these barriers, but who's going to fund that work? So I think a lot of the questions remain about what type of funding is going to be available for the FDA and kind of other, CDC and maybe some other federal agencies that could kind of help with some of this. That's a big question.
Yes, I completely agree with you. I've always described the barriers to conducting cannabis research is having to navigate all of the various restrictions, including that Schedule 1 DEA,
Yeah.
humongous barrier that researchers have to
Yeah.
get through. And with that DEA Schedule 1 limitation, also includes not being able to work directly with the products that folks are using, that's available to the general public.
Right.
Um, and then finally, funding, right? I mean, we need a really steady source of funding that allows researchers to really investigate the positives, the negatives, all the aspects of cannabis so that we have a full picture and can make informed decisions about whether that's, policy decisions or as a consumer, informed decisions about the products that are available to the public right now.
Yeah, that gets me thinking, Agnes, in terms of, I mean, obviously there are folks at the federal level that are thinking about changes at the federal policy. And, as I said, there are a lot of different ways this could look, different levels of taxes, different types of taxes, potentially minimum unit prices. But I think as you're beginning to kind of do the analysis there, you could also think about how much money will be, say there is some type of federal tax, how much of that money will be allocated to doing these types of education efforts or prevention, or additional funding for research. So I think that's another aspect as well, and thinking through what this means in terms of the price drops. Yeah.
Exactly. Um, two two questions, kind of unrelated, but I'm going to try to see if I can tie them together. One is about how much do you see cannabis legalization linked or impacting other intoxicating novel products like psychedelics or others? Should they be linked? Are they totally different? Are they relevant in the cannabis conversation? And before jurisdictions or researchers take on projects or think about their approach, what sorts of analysis should they be doing?
Actually, Agnes, what's the last part in terms of the analysis for other products as well, or
Yes, hold on one second. Let me see if I can. What sort of analysis would you recommend before suggesting goals or projects?
okay, let's do these separately. So,
Yeah.
in terms of linking with other um, with other novel products. And so I see that the question mentioned psilocybin and kratom. And those are two very different substances. And I do think, I mean, obviously these are different products with very different, health consequences. I mean, obviously a lot depending on the dose and setting. I do think so I'm actually been doing a ton of work in the psychedelics policy space, and states are, you've got all this interesting clinical research going on, but you have some states just moving ahead here. So obviously, Oregon's got the supervised psilocybin use, Colorado does as well, but Colorado has this interesting twist where they also allow adults to forage, grow, possess, and give away psilocybin and a few other plant-based psychedelics. You can't sell it, but I mean, there's some interesting bartering going on. Um, and you've got in New Mexico just passed a supervised psilocybin use as well, but only for those with certain medical conditions. And look, you've got a couple state, and there's a tremendous amount of activity happening within state legislatures. I mean, it's easy to introduce a bill, but I mean, there are a couple states that are actually they've got active legislation which would allow for retail psilocybin sales. I don't know if those are going to pass, but I do think thinking through, when I kind of think about this and I think about, well, what can we learn from cannabis, is just, especially if you unleash a for-profit commercial market like we did, n thinking about what the products and the kind of the health profiles of those products are going to be in 10 years, that's something you need to think about. I mean, 10 years ago, nobody was talking about Delta 8, Delta 10, all these other products, or even thinking about, intoxicating hemp in general. Um, but now we're dealing with that. So I think about this now in terms of when I'm talking to people about psilocybin. Yes, we talk about, the existing mushrooms and, and the products that are made from that. But if you unleash the commercial industry on this, who knows what the products are going to look like in 10 years? So I do think there's some work that could be done now in terms of thinking that through. Whether or not it makes sense for a cannabis regulatory agency to take on psilocybin, I think it's really going to depend on kind of what the models look like. Is it going to be a more medical market? Because in some places you've got health agencies kind of regulating, and in other places it's part of, more like Department of Commerce. So I think you want to kind of see how that plays out. Um, in terms of the goals, I mean, I think really, people used to talk about, okay, we're going to use social equity efforts in cannabis to help kind of build generational wealth in certain communities. And I think that creates that bar is too high, this idea of generational wealth. But really thinking about the economic well-being. Like, okay, if my goal is to improve the economic situation in a certain community or a certain group of communities, just run the numbers. Like, okay, if I'm going to give out X number of licenses, I expect that it's going to generate this much revenue and this much profit, and how much of that's actually going to stay in those communities, right? Really kind of thinking that through. And also, and what's the potential risk for them not making a profit and potentially going under, and therefore, the costs associated with all of that time and effort that they put into this. It gets to this larger point that I was saying, it might make more sense to, if you're going to be, creating these entrepreneurship groups or entrepreneurship opportunities or employment, maybe putting that into maybe already existing programs that the state has or local governments that they have. But it's really thinking through, okay, how many licenses, how much revenue can we expect? And just really kind of thinking this through. I think the idea it sounds great. Like, okay, we're going to bring these individuals who've been disproportionately affected by, cannabis prohibition into the mix here and with the goal of improving economic well-being. Well, there are a lot of different ways about going about doing that. So I think that's where I would start the analysis. What group or groups are you talking about? What are those specific goals? Thinking about the policy options, and then also thinking about the potential, could it actually backfire? Yeah.
Yeah, I think you make an excellent point. And one of the questions that was also submitted previously is that it seems like when folks talk about social equity, everybody, I think everybody has a different definition in their head, right? Or
Yeah.
different kind of application of what that actually means.
Yeah.
What have you seen kind of in the way that states have implemented how states are looking at or defining social equity?
Yeah, like I said, I think, a lot of states avoid using, focusing on race or ethnicity because they're worried about lawsuits. So they'll use different proxies, for example, arrest rates or maybe even disparities in arrest rates in certain communities and using that to figure out which ones they should prioritize. But, there are other, some states, they'll include veterans as a special group in terms of equity. And so there is variation there as well. But I do think in a lot of places, the focus really has been on race ethnicity without saying those words. I mean, I think that's what's ended up happening because, yeah, people worry about lawsuits, not only potentially shutting down that aspect of a social equity program, but I've talked to states that were worried about if they even do some type of license preferencing based on that they're worried that it could shut down their entire equity program, including, efforts to kind of help with expungement and sealing. So I think there's been a real aversion to kind of being specific about it, but instead kind of using these proxies.
Yeah, thank you. Do you think that rescheduling of cannabis for medical use and eventually for non-medical use will trend towards harm reduction policies, like the creation of the supervised consumption sites or the overdose prevention sites?
I don't know. I mean, there's a whole separate conversation happening about different states licensing kind of cannabis consumption lounges, right? I mean, you see those popping up in different places. Whether or not, I mean, I think I mean, this is a little bit, I mean, in some ways, when we think about education, that can be a form of harm reduction in terms of, potentially helping people understand, starting, starting low and going slow and, and thinking about, um, being thoughtful about what they're consuming and where they're consuming. But I think once again, this depends on funding. Right. I mean, some states are using their cannabis tax revenues to implement these programs, and it'd be fascinating to see the analysis looking at the different states and what they've put their money into, and whether or not they really think they're getting, whether or not it's paying off. Um, But yeah, no, I definitely think they're, in terms of, I mean, look at what's happening in Canada, 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 right? I mean, there's been a big focus on kind of lower risk use guidelines. And so I can imagine there being more, I mean, there are conversations about that here, but you can imagine them becoming more prominent. Um, yeah, I mean, the whole thing about having conversations about supervised consumption sites or overdose prevention, and that's a whole kind of separate conversation. And and also you've got to be real careful. I mean, depending at the federal level, I mean, there's been kind of a real resistance now to most forms of harm reduction. I mean, there is still money going toward naloxone, but there's been a recent, not even provide, trying to cut funding for even fentanyl test strips. And so I think you need, I mean, you might want to use a different phrase there. You could think maybe you could think about this more in terms of, different types of education. There's education for people who haven't used, but education for those people who are consuming and what to look out for. Yeah.
Right. Do you think that health or work insurance companies are going to change any of their practices, including by providing education or guidance to their participants?
I don't know. I hope so. I mean, regardless of this whole rescheduling conversation, I mean, look, it was even a couple years ago, my colleague John Calkins had published showing that the number of people who were using cannabis on a daily or near daily basis exceeded the number that were using alcohol on a daily or near daily basis. That was a couple years ago, and I think the trend has continued. And so I think there's a lot more we have to learn about. There's a lot more that can be done in terms of education. But I gotta say, there's a real concern about some of these higher potency products. And that said, I was part of a team that tried to evaluate the research on this. And so we did this fancy systematic review and looked at, had all these studies, narrowed it down to 40 or 50 or something. And at the end of the day, the evidence base just isn't strong. I mean, it definitely the research said, hey, look, it seemed to point toward, people who are using some of the higher potency products being more likely to suffer from cannabis use disorder. There was a less of a connection with mental health, but there was some issues there. But the bottom line is most of these studies are based on self-report. And so, I mean, one of these things I'm hoping that with this, with the AG's rescheduling order, where it specifically called out, these products, I'm hoping it makes it easier for researchers to do this. Now, I don't know, but I still believe that the researchers would still, I don't know to what extent they still would need some type of FDA approval in order to be able to use those products in their research. And so, will that be expedited? Will that take a year or two to, I mean, those types of details really matter, right? If you could expedite to the extent you need some additional approvals. And I mean, I don't do the clinical work, so that's not really my space. But I do know that, like, to the extent you would need the FDA or others to approve, if you could expedite that, because we still really have a lot to learn about these products, that,
Yeah.
especially the higher potency products. And that's going to be information that hopefully would then guide some of these education and prevention kind of messaging campaigns.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've from what I've heard from our researchers is, I mean, and kind of the way that things go is that FDA approval will still be needed to be able
Yeah,
to
I think
conduct
so.
these clinical trials and including using state products. And then the challenge for there will be for the ability to provide the drug master files for these drugs so that the researchers can obtain their or get approval for the INDs. And if I think that will be kind of the biggest sticking point. I think FDA
Yeah,
is really um, does a very close review of the work,
yeah.
rightly so, right? I mean, we want to make sure that products that we're giving to folks are safe
Hmm.
and all that, and especially when we don't might not have the existing evidence base to be able to build off that knowledge, right? But it is very challenging, and I think it will still continue to be challenging despite the progress that's been happening.
Yeah.
Um, I want to ask, and there was one more question to going back to the difference between uh, cannabis and psychedelics. Why do you think in the public's eye these are so different? Why are they kind of being perceived to be, uh, I think the public perception of the two products seem to be so different, right?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is the all the clinical research that's going on. So there have been, a number of kind of randomized controlled trials that have looked at how various psychedelics affect different mental health conditions. And there've been a number of positive studies related to the use of MDMA to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. Also, using psilocybin to treat or to address treatment-resistant depression. There's also other studies focused on substance use disorder. There's one that came out about cocaine just last week. And I think those stories get a ton of press. And so you've got all of that going on. So you have all of the interesting clinical research going on. Then there have been a number of media stories that have largely focused on veterans. Anderson Cooper, focused on this group that, a lot of people going down to Mexico to, they've tried other treatments. They haven't been successful. So they go down to use ibogaine or psilocybin or some of these other substances to treat it there. Those stories get a lot of media attention. So I think that, and then on top of all of that, you've got this whole focus on microdosing, right? And so I did some work with some colleagues to show that in 2025, about 10 million American adults reported microdosing either psilocybin, LSD, or MDMA in the past year. Um, and it's really interesting there. So, people report microdosing, to help with some mental health issues or with, creativity, energy, other outcomes. You look at the clinical research on this. Where they've done the randomized controlled trials, you get the microdose, you get a placebo, you don't really see much of an effect. That said, I was part of this panel. I was really interested. I was part of this panel actually last Friday. What was it? No, a couple Fridays ago, with a researcher who does a lot of this in the lab, and she said, yes, if you look at the studies, um, for individuals where they've randomly assigned whether or not you get the microdose, whether it be LSD or something else, or the placebo. Most of that work is with kind of what they call, neurotypical or healthy individuals, right? You don't see much of an effect. And some people say, well, maybe the measures they're using aren't able to detect these small differences. But anyways, she was showing some preliminary research. So there's a lot more to be done, saying that if you do that research, not necessarily on individuals who don't have any mental health conditions, but focusing on those with severe depression, they're finding that LSD microdosing might make a difference. Now, I'm not endorsing that. I don't know. Like, there's a lot more we have to learn, but it's interesting once we begin focusing on specific populations, what we're going to learn. So that's a long way of saying I think all this attention between the clinical trials, what's happening with veterans, the executive order. I think there's a lot of and also some of these state reforms. I think that's one of the big differences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Got another question in here. What are the chances that rescheduling to Schedule 3 results in cannabis getting an NDC code similar to pharmaceuticals?
I have no idea. No, no, no. No, that's a great question. And look, at the end of the day, what this order does is it moves these products that are produced and sold as part of state legal cannabis markets from one to three. It doesn't give FDA approval to cannabis, right? There's a whole process for substances or even, botanicals to go through. And this doesn't necessarily expedite that. So until that were to happen, I wouldn't even think about NDC codes. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what makes that picture a whole lot more complicated in terms of FDA approval is FDA's approval of Epidiolex, which they
Yep.
approved Epidiolex as a drug specifically for certain childhood seizures.
Yep.
And what's challenge what I think FDA gets kind of hung up on is that once they approve one thing as a drug, it cannot be something else at the same time,
Yeah.
right? And so, whether it's a supplement or other things that we've kind of, I think, been lobbied to treat cannabis as doesn't
Mhm.
work in the FDA approval pathway process. So
Yeah.
it's a complicated picture.
Yeah, and Agnes, you raise a good point where I should have been more specific. So it's not just that, botanical cannabis would have to get approved, go through the approval process for the FDA, but it's for specific conditions. It's not just some type of blanket approval. So that's the other thing too. Obviously, if it does get approved and you end up this situation, like we see with ketamine, you've got a ton of off-label use, right? You see this for other substances as well.
Great. Well, that's all the questions I'm seeing in the chat. While I put my screen up, I'll let anyone else ask any final questions that they might have that or questions that I might have missed. Any final takers? Uh, Final takers? Oops, I'm sharing the wrong screen. But anyway, so I want to make sure that you have the QR code right here for you to fill out to give us any feedback on this series that we had. I really want to thank Beau. Beau, all of your insights are so helpful as we all navigate this crazy time that we're in. Um, and thank you so much for joining
Yeah.
us today. It was a really engaging session.
Yeah, no, and thank you so much for the opportunity. And like I said, for anyone else, if you have any other questions, feel free just to shoot me an email. And like I said, if I don't have the answers, I can try to point you in the direction of the people who do. So thanks again.
Great. Thank you, Beau.